Marcus Papadopoulos is a publisher and editor of Politics First, who joins us from London. Just in the past few hours, Marcus Papadopoulos, there was a video that emerged that showed clearly boxes of U.S. weapons that were at one of these hideouts that the Nusra Front has in Aleppo. And clearly on it, it said that it came from the U.S. from a base somewhere in Yugoslavia, but it had the U.S. stamp on it. This, along with multiple evidences that the Syrian UN ambassador has presented throughout the years that shows different actors, such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the U.S., providing this type of support for these terrorists. But yet, it doesn't go that far. But then again, here we go, and here are more evidence from the UN ambassador, or the Syrian ambassador to the UN.
Can I say very quickly that the Americans have once again this week said that America respects international law. That must be refuted, and it can be refuted by citing the American illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, the American illegal bombing of Serbia, in which they dropped depleted uranium shells on Serbia, and also in which the Americans recognized Kosovo's universal declaration of independence. So it's very important when the Americans make these comments, and which are then spun by Western media, that they are refuted. International law does not exist in the lexicon of American governments. Now, turning to the allegations made by Syria's ambassador to the United Nations, he is absolutely correct. The Americans have been almost from the first day that al-Nusra emerged in the conflict in Syria, they have been supporting them. They have been supporting them with weapons. They have been supporting them logistically, and they have been supporting them with money. And we can say that that since the American air campaign, and I used air campaign in Syria, the Americans have not once attacked al-Nusra. Now, al-Nusra is al-Qaeda, and we know the potent threat that al-Qaeda poses to innocent men and women across the world. Yet the Americans have not touched al-Nusra, and they make this flimsy, baseless argument that they will only start attacking al-Nusra once the so-called moderate groups in Syria break away from al-Nusra. Well, the question is this: why are those so-called moderate groups fighting alongside al-Nusra in the first place if they are not extremists? The reality is that the so-called Free Syrian Army and al-Nusra, for example, are both Islamic fundamentalist terrorist groups, and they cooperated, for example, in the occupation of Malula a couple of years ago, that beautiful ancient town in Syria where the inhabitants speak the language of Jesus Christ, Aramaic. Both those groups, the Free Syrian Army and al-Nusra, occupied it, and they committed terrible acts of vandalism against Christian icons. So the Americans, without a doubt, are supporting al-Nusra. And if we look at it from an American perspective, why would the Americans really want to bomb al-Nusra? They know that al-Nusra, after ISIS, is the most formidable Islamist terrorist group in Syria, and they know that al-Nusra poses a terrible threat to the Syrian army. And the Americans want to see the Syrian army defeated, and therefore, with the Syrian army being defeated, that would mean the collapse of the Syrian government and an Islamist regime coming to power in Damascus. The Americans know that al-Nusra is that group which could theoretically bring that about. So why would the Americans want to bomb them in the first place? No. Al-Nusra, like the other Islamist terrorist groups in Syria, is a proxy group of the Americans being used to try and overthrow the Syrian government. And I would also like to add that the Americans this week have also made this disgusting statement that if Russia doesn't cease its air campaign in Aleppo, which is about liberating East Aleppo from Islamist control, then Russians are going to die, Russian towns and cities could be bombed. The Americans need to elaborate on that comment. Are they saying that they're going to give the go-ahead, the green light, to their terrorist friends in the Islamist world to start carrying out terrorist acts in Russia? They've made a very, very serious, provocative comment, and now they need to explain that comment.
Well, given that you're touching on that, and they have said that, do you think that the reaction from Russia should be to break off talks? Because right now we're looking at these talks, so-called talks, on life support. The U.S. has said that. It doesn't seem like there's any purpose behind the continuation of talks with the U.S., even though Russia is still opening that avenue or leaving that avenue open. What path do you think this is going to take?
Well, Russia is demonstrating how responsible it is, how responsible it is as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. And of course, today Russia takes over the chairmanship of the United Nations Security Council. And the United Nations is all about trying to bring about peace in conflict zones. And that is what Russia has been trying to do from day one. However, the Americans and their allies, the British, the Turks, the Saudis and the Qataris, they are not genuinely interested in seeing a peaceful solution to the conflict in Syria. Why? Because they want the Syrian army they want the Syrian army to be defeated outright. It's as simple as that. And they want President Assad and the Syrian government to be overthrown. And they want their own people to come to power in Damascus, which would spell the end of Russian influence and power in the Middle East, which is very important for countering the American dominance of the Middle East. And it would also allow Israel to reign supreme in that part of the Middle East, because of course Israel's nemesis, Syria, would have collapsed. So regrettably, while the Russians are behaving in an admirable, very honourable way in trying to bring about a peaceful solution to the conflict in Syria, the Americans, they don't want to play ball, they're not interested in it, and they simply want to see their proxies on the ground in Syria, al-Nusra, the so-called Free Syrian Army, and the other Islamist terrorist groups succeed.
Publisher and editor at Politics First, Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you.